Today, we're ranking every major tank of World War II, from the steel coffins that doomed their crews to the machine that dominated the battlefield.
Tier 5. Obsolete, mechanically flawed. 20. Fiat L3-35. Italy.
Picture Italy, 1935. Mussolini is riding high on imperial ambition. His engineers hand him a tank. Well, they call it a tank, and it rolls out looking like something a child built with a tin can and an engine stolen from a motorcycle. This is the Fiat L3-35, and it is, without question, one of the most embarrassing machines ever sent into combat. Let's talk numbers, because numbers don't lie. The L3-35 weighed just 3.2 tons, roughly the weight of a large pickup truck today. Its armor, a paper-thin 13 millimeters at its thickest. For context, a standard rifle bullet at close range could punch through it. A rifle, not a rocket, not a cannon, a rifle. Its crew was 2 men, crammed into a hole barely big enough to breathe in. It had no turret. Instead, it had a pair of 8mm machine guns fixed to the front, meaning the entire tank had to rotate to aim at anything. Want to shoot something on your left? Turn the whole vehicle. During a battle, under fire, good luck. Italy deployed these things in Ethiopia, in Spain, and catastrophically in the western desert of North Africa. British crews in Matilda tanks didn't even bother calling them threats. Soldiers nicknamed them sardine tins. In the 1940 campaign in France, some were destroyed by enemy infantry with anti-tank rifles, weapons designed for far heavier targets. The L3-35 wasn't a tank. It was a liability with a flag painted on it.
19. Type 95 Hago, Japan.
Now we move to the Pacific, and to a machine that was, in its time, not entirely terrible. The problem is, time moved on, and the Hago didn't. Japan's Type 95 Hago entered service in 1935 and was designed to support infantry across the vast, road-scarce terrain of China and Southeast Asia. At 7.4 tons, it was fast, hitting nearly 45 kilometers per hour, and for 1935, that wasn't nothing. It had a 37mm main gun and enough armor, 12mm maximum, to stop small arms fire. Against Chinese forces in the late 1930s, it worked. The Japanese army swept through Manchuria and China partly on the back of armor like this. But then came 1941, the Pacific War. And suddenly, the Hago was fighting a completely different enemy with completely different weapons. American M4 Shermans, the 37mm gun bounced off their hulls. Landing on Pacific Islands meant jungle terrain where speed meant nothing. At Guadalcanal, at Tarawa, at Saipan, Hago tanks were destroyed by American bazookas, artillery, and even concentrated rifle fire at vulnerable points. The tragedy of the Hago isn't that it was poorly built. It's that Japan never replaced it with anything better in time. They kept sending 1935 technology into 1944 battles. Thousands of Japanese tankers died as a result.
18.
Crusader, United Kingdom. Fast, fearless, and fundamentally broken. If the Panzer 38T was outdated by circumstance, the Crusader was outdated by design, and that distinction matters because the British had no excuse. The Crusader was born from a peculiarly British idea, the cruiser tank doctrine. The thinking was that tanks shouldn't fight tanks. Tanks should exploit gaps in the enemy line, race deep into territory, and cause chaos. Leave the anti-tank work to someone else, apparently. So the Crusader was built fast, 27 miles per hour in the desert, genuinely impressive for 1941. It looked the part too, long, low, almost elegant in that angular 1940s way.
But it spent more time broken down than it did fighting. The Nuffield Liberty engine, sourced from American aircraft of the First World War, was temperamental in the North African heat. Dust got into everything. The cooling systems were under-engineered for desert conditions. In the first major operation that bore its name, Operation Crusader in Libya, 1941, British armored units lost more Crusaders to mechanical failure than to German gunfire. Let that sit for a moment. And when it did fight, the 2-pounder gun it carried couldn't penetrate the frontal armor of a Panzer IV at any reasonable combat range. The crews knew it. They called it the 2-pounder pop gun. They weren't wrong. The Crusader had one trick: speed. And North Africa eventually taught the British that speed without hitting power is just a faster way to die.
17.
Panzer 38T, Germany/Czechoslovakia. The tank that outlived its usefulness before the war even started. Here's a story about a tank that technically did everything right and was still completely wrong for the war it ended up fighting. The Panzer 38T wasn't even German, it was Czech. Built by Škoda for the Czechoslovakian army, the Germans seized it in 1938 when they marched into Prague and looked at it and thought, actually, not bad. And in 1939 against Poland, it wasn't bad. Against France in 1940, still just about holding its own. But then came Barbarossa, June 1941, the Soviet Union, and the 38T met the T-34. Its 37mm gun, which had been perfectly adequate against everything it had faced, simply bounced off Soviet armor. The Soviets called it the lighter, not as a compliment. They meant it sparked harmlessly, like a cigarette lighter that wouldn't catch.
The Germans, to their credit, weren't stupid. They pulled the 38T off the front lines. But here's the detail that most people miss. They didn't scrap them. They gutted them, stripped out the turrets, and turned the chassis into tank destroyers and reconnaissance vehicles. The Martyr series, the Hetzer, some of the most effective German light armor of the mid-war period came from the bones of this machine. So the Panzer 38T ends up at this place of this list not because it was a failure, but because it was already obsolete on the day the war got serious. And in a conflict that rewarded evolution, standing still was a death sentence.
16. M3 Lee, United States.
Here's where the story gets complicated, because the M3 Lee doesn't belong at number 8 because it was stupid. It belongs here because it was desperate. By 1940, the U.S. Army desperately needed a medium tank. The Germans were steamrolling Europe with their Panzer IIIs and IVs. America had nothing ready. Their M2 medium tank was outdated, and the M4 Sherman wasn't ready yet. So American engineers made a brutally pragmatic decision. They took a 75mm gun, the gun they needed, and instead of mounting it in a proper turret, which they couldn't manufacture fast enough, they bolted it to the side of the hull. Then they stuck a small 37mm turret on top for good measure. The result looked like a rolling apartment building, and British crews in North Africa, who received it via Lend-Lease, immediately nicknamed it the Grant, and then quietly complained that it was a nightmare. The problems were many. The hull-mounted 75mm gun had a very limited field of traverse, about 15 degrees. To aim, you essentially had to point the whole tank. The silhouette was enormous, nearly 3 meters tall, making it one of the easiest targets in the desert. German anti-tank crews called it the shop window because it was so visible. And yet, and this matters, at the Second Battle of El Alamein and in the early North African campaign, the M3 Lee was the only Allied tank that could even threaten German armor at range. It bought time. Real, costly, necessary time. The Lee wasn't a great tank, but it was the right tank for a desperate moment in history.
Tier 4. Specialized or mediocre. 15. Churchill tank, United Kingdom.
Nobody who saw a Churchill tank for the first time was impressed. It was wide. It was slow, top speed of about 25 kilometers per hour on a good day. It looked like a giant mechanical caterpillar from the First World War. Early models were so mechanically unreliable that British tankers told dark jokes about them. And yet, the Churchill earned a reputation among those who fought alongside it that bordered on reverence. The reason? Armor. The Churchill Mk7 carried up to 152 millimeters of frontal armor, thicker than the Tiger I at its heaviest points. German anti-tank guns that shredded other Allied tanks frequently ricocheted off the Churchill's hull. At the Battle of Medellin in Tunisia in 1943, and more famously in the Italian campaign in Normandy, Churchills absorbed punishment that would have destroyed anything else on the field. But the Churchill's true genius was terrain. While Shermans and Panthers were road-dependent, the Churchill's wide tracks and low ground pressure let it climb slopes and cross ground that other tanks simply couldn't manage. At the Battle of Longstop Hill in Tunisia, Churchills climbed terrain so steep that German defenders had literally left it undefended. They assumed no tank could get up there. It was no weapon of blitzkrieg, but as a machine for grinding through the hardest fighting of the war, Italy, Normandy, the Reichswald, the Churchill was, quietly, magnificent.
14. Panzer III, Germany.
If you want to understand Germany's rise and fall in World War II, watch the Panzer III. Its story is the story of the Wehrmacht's armor. Designed in the mid-1930s and deployed in mass from 1939 onward, the Panzer III was everything a pre-war tank should be. Well-built, reliable, with a 3-man turret crew that gave it a genuine tactical advantage. Most tanks of the era had the commander also serving as the gunner, meaning he was always distracted. The Panzer III separated those roles. In Poland, in France, in the early days of Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union, the Panzer III was terrifying.
It mounted a 50mm gun that could handle most Allied and Soviet armor through 1941. Its crews were trained with an almost religious intensity. German tank tactics, radio-equipped vehicles operating in coordinated formations, were years ahead of anyone else. But here's where the story turns dark. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, they met the T-34, and the Panzer III's 50mm gun could barely scratch it. The armor? Insufficient. Germany tried to upgrade it, longer gun, more armor plating, but the tank's hull simply couldn't carry much more weight without breaking down. By 1943, the Panzer III was being pulled from frontline combat and reassigned to training and secondary roles. A tank that had helped conquer a continent, rendered obsolete in 2 years. That's the brutality of technological war.
13.
Matilda II, the United Kingdom, the queen that ruled too short a kingdom. Now here's where it gets interesting, because the Matilda II, for a brief window in 1940, was the most dangerous tank on the Western Front, full stop. At Arras, in May 1940, a column of Matilda IIs caused a near panic in the German high command. German anti-tank guns couldn't stop them. Standard artillery couldn't stop them. Rommel, yes, that Rommel, then commanding the 7th Panzer Division, had to personally redirect 88mm anti-aircraft guns against them in a flat trajectory ground roll just to bring them down. The Matilda's armor, at 78mm on the whole front, was virtually impenetrable to anything the Germans had in 1940 that was actually meant to fight tanks. The Germans called it Queen of the Desert in grudging admiration during the early North African campaign.
But here's the problem with being a queen. Empires change. By 1942, German tanks carried longer, more powerful guns. The 50mm, then the long 75mm. The Matilda's armor, which had seemed invincible, was now just adequate. And her own gun, the 2-pounder again, was still that same pop gun the Crusader carried. She could take a hit, she couldn't land one. Worse, she was slow. 15 miles per hour maximum. In a war that was beginning to move at the speed of armored columns, the Matilda shuffled. A tank that was briefly unstoppable, undone by the passage of just 2 years. That's the cruelest kind of obsolescence.
12.
Stug 3, Germany. The accountant's tank that accidentally became the war's most efficient killer. Here's a number for you. Over 10,000 Stug 3s were built between 1940 and 1945. No other German armored vehicle comes close to that production figure. And it wasn't even supposed to be a tank. The Stug 3, Sturmgeschütz assault gun, was designed to be mobile artillery. Walk with the infantry, knock out bunkers and machine gun nests. That's it. It was given a low silhouette, no rotating turret to keep it cheap and fast to produce, and a short-barreled 75mm howitzer that was fine for blowing up buildings and terrible for fighting tanks. Then, the Eastern Front happened. The Germans upgunned it, fitted the long 75mm, the same gun eventually going into the Panzer IV, and suddenly the Stug 3 could kill anything the Soviets put in the field at combat range. It was lower to the ground than almost any tank it faced, harder to hit. It could move quickly between firing positions.
Stug crews developed tactics that were years ahead of the rest of German armored doctrine. Shoot, move, never stay still, use terrain, let the enemy come to you. The Stug didn't have a rotating turret, so it compensated with positioning. Its crews became masters of the ambush. By mid-war, Stug 3 units were collectively claiming more tank kills than the entire Panzer force. German infantry units specifically requested Stug support, trusted them over tanks because they stayed forward. They didn't retreat to rearm when things got difficult. What makes the Stug 3 extraordinary isn't that it was the best designed vehicle. It wasn't. It's that necessity and pragmatism accidentally created something more effective than the things that were planned to be effective. It's the tank that won by not being a tank at all. 11.
KV-1, Soviet Union, the monster that should have won and didn't. There is a recorded engagement from the summer of 1941, verified by German military records, where a single KV-1 blocked an entire German division on a road near Rasania, Lithuania, for nearly 2 days. 2 days. 1 tank, 1 division. German anti-tank rounds bounced off it. A 50mm gun truck drove up behind it and fired 12 rounds at point-blank range into the engine compartment. The KV-1 turned around and destroyed the truck. They eventually brought up an 88 and buried it in a concealed position nearby to ambush it.
So why isn't the KV-1 higher on this list? Because beyond individual acts of almost mythological stubbornness, it failed at the thing that wins wars: scale, coordination, and operational reliability. The KV-1's transmission was notoriously unreliable. Drivers trained on it described shifting gears as a physical combat exercise. You needed a mallet, literally.
Some crews kept mallets inside the tank for gear changes. It also had a radio problem. Many early KV-1s went into battle with no radios at all. Crews communicated by flag. By 1941, against Blitzkrieg, the KV-1 was a magnificent statement of intent. We can build something you cannot stop. The Soviets just hadn't yet figured out how to build something you couldn't break either.
Tier 3. Capable heavy hitters. 10. Jagd Panther.
The machine that the war deserved and that Germany built too late to save itself. Everything about the Jagd Panther is almost perfect, which makes the story of what it actually accomplished, or rather failed to accomplish, one of the war's great tragedies of timing and production. Take the Panther tank, one of the most balanced, capable armored vehicles produced by any nation in the war. Then remove the turret, lower the silhouette to just over 2.7 meters, and mount an 88mm Pak 43/3, not the Tiger I's 88, but a longer, more powerful evolution of it, in a fixed casemate with a thick, well-angled glacis plate. What you get is a vehicle that from the front is virtually invulnerable to everything the Allies fielded in 1944, except at extremely close range. Its gun could destroy a Sherman at 2 kilometers. 2 kilometers. That is barely in visual range. It could kill IS-2s, it could kill Pershings, it could theoretically have killed anything that existed. But here is the number that defines the Jagd Panther's tragedy: 415. That is the total number built for the entire war. Each one that broke down became irreplaceable. Each one lost to a mechanical fault or an airstrike or simply running out of fuel, because by 1944 Germany was running out of fuel, was gone forever. The Jagd Panther sits here of this list because by any objective measure of what a tank destroyer should be, protection, firepower, mobility, it represents the apex of World War II armored engineering. German engineers, given enough time and enough steel, had genuinely figured it out. They just couldn't build enough of them. They couldn't build enough of anything. And that gap between engineering genius and industrial reality is ultimately what this whole ranking is about.
9. Tiger I, Germany.
The Tiger I didn't just dominate battlefields, it dominated minds. Even before Allied soldiers had faced one in combat, they'd heard stories. By 1943, Tiger phobia, a genuine documented psychological phenomenon, was affecting Allied tank crews who would report Tigers in every engagement, even when none were present. The tank had become a myth before most men had seen one. The Tiger I earned that fear. Its 88mm KWK-36 gun, derived from the legendary Flak 88 anti-aircraft cannon, could destroy any Allied or Soviet tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. Its frontal armor was 100mm thick, angled or flat, and required special approaches to defeat. At Villers-Bocage in June 1944, SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann, commanding a single Tiger I, destroyed approximately 14 tanks, 15 personnel carriers, and 2 anti-tank guns in a single engagement before withdrawing safely. But the Tiger had a fatal flaw, and it was built into its very bones. It was too heavy, too expensive, and too difficult to maintain. At 57 tons, it broke bridges. Its overlapping wheel system, innovative in theory, packed with mud in Russian winters and froze solid. A single Tiger cost roughly the same resources as 4 Panzer IVs. Germany built only 1,347 of them. Ferocious, legendary, self-defeating.
8.
IS-2, the Eisen-Stalin, the hammer that Stalin built to shatter German mythology. By 1943, the Soviet High Command had a problem that was as much psychological as it was military. German armor, specifically the Tiger I, had become something close to a legend in the minds of Soviet infantry. Men were surrendering at the sight of one. The propaganda effect of German heavy tanks was real, measurable, and dangerous. The IS-2 was the Soviet answer, and it was not subtle. The 12-22mm main gun it carried was derived from a field artillery piece. It was not designed for tank combat. It was designed to fire high-explosive shells into fortifications and watch the fortifications stop existing. When the Soviets pointed it at a Tiger I and pulled the trigger, the result was not a penetrating round that passed through the armor. It was a round that removed the turret, often intact, often thrown meters away.
At Kursk, at the Vistula-Oder offensive, through Berlin itself, IS-2 units were given a specific tactical assignment: kill the myth. Go after the Tigers and Panthers first. Make sure the infantry watching understood that the Germans could be destroyed. It worked. But here's what's rarely discussed. The IS-2 had a painful reload time, 2-3 rounds per minute at best, with a separate propellant charge that the loader had to handle independently. In close combat, where a Sherman might get 3 shots away, the IS-2 got 1. The designers accepted this. They decided 1 shot from a 122mm was worth more than 3 shots from anything smaller. And looking at the kill records, looking at what IS-2 units accomplished in the final offensives of the war, it's very hard to argue with that logic. The IS-2 wasn't built to be versatile. It was built to be terrifying, and it was.
7.
M26 Pershing, United States, the tank America built when it finally admitted it was losing. There is a photograph, if you haven't seen it, look it up after this, taken in Cologne, March 1945. A destroyed German Panther sits in a plaza. Next to it, a Pershing that killed it. Behind both of them, miraculously intact, Cologne Cathedral. It's one of the most famous tank photographs of the war. What it captures is the moment America's armored doctrine finally grew up. For most of the war, the United States Army's official position was that tanks don't fight tanks. That's what tank destroyers are for. Tanks support infantry. So they built the Sherman, a fine infantry support vehicle, and sent it up against Panthers and Tigers. The results were not good.
The Army eventually had to acknowledge what its tankers had been screaming for 2 years. They needed something that could look a German heavy in the eye. The M26 Pershing was the answer. A 90mm gun that could penetrate Tiger I frontal armor at 1,000 yards. Armor that could actually absorb punishment. But here's what rarely gets said. The Pershing almost didn't happen. Senior American commanders, most notably General Leslie McNair, actively suppressed its development because it didn't fit the doctrine. American tankers and Shermans died while bureaucratic arguments played out in Washington about whether the war even needed a heavy tank. The Pershing arrived in combat in February 1945, 3 months before Germany surrendered. It was definitively the best tank America produced in World War II. It also arrived so late that only 20 saw combat in Europe. The lesson it carries isn't about armor or firepower. It's about what happens when institutional thinking lags behind battlefield reality.
6. Panther tank, Germany.
The Panther didn't start as Germany's best idea. It started as Germany's panicked reaction to the T-34. After the shock of 1941, after realizing their existing tanks were outclassed, German engineers were sent to study captured T-34s on the Eastern Front. Their mission? Copy what works, improve what doesn't. The result, entering service in 1943, was the Panzerkampfwagen V Panther. Everything about the Panther was designed to win. Its sloped frontal hull armor, 80mm at 55 degrees, was, for practical purposes, nearly impenetrable by any Allies fielded. The long 75mm Kvak 42 gun had a muzzle velocity so high that it could penetrate the T-34's front plate at 1,500 meters, farther than most gunners could accurately identify targets. It combined the T-34's sloping armor concept with German precision engineering and a proper 3-man turret crew. The Panther's first major engagement, Kursk, July 1943, was a disaster due to mechanical teething problems. The initial versions broke down constantly. Transmissions overheated, final drives failed, the tanks arrived at the front with unresolved manufacturing defects. Nearly half the Panthers at Kursk were knocked out by mechanical failure, not enemy fire. But Germany fixed those problems. By late 1943 and through 1944, the mature Panther Ausf A and G variants were the most balanced fighting vehicles of the entire war. Allied tank commanders in Normandy considered the Panther, not the Tiger, their most dangerous opponent, precisely because it combined hitting power, protection, and mobility that the Tiger lacked. American General Omar Bradley's headquarters issued a bulletin warning that the Panther outclassed any Allied tank in head-to-head combat. The only reliable way to kill one from the front was with a 17-pounder British gun, a lucky shot to the gun mantlet, or flanking fire.
The Germans lost the war, but they built the template for every tank that came after it.
Tier 2, elite mediums and late war success. 5. Panzer IV, Germany.
Here is a tank with a story of pure, stubborn survival. The Panzer IV was designed in 1936 as a support tank, meant to carry a short 75mm howitzer to blast infantry and fortifications while the Panzer III handled enemy tanks. It was never meant to be Germany's main battle tank. And then history had other plans. When the Panzer III proved inadequate against Soviet armor, Germany faced a crisis. But the Panzer IV had one critical advantage. Its hull was slightly larger and could be upgraded. Engineers fitted a long, high-velocity 75mm gun, the KWK-40, and suddenly Germany had something that could fight the T-34 on equal terms. They kept upgrading it, Ausführung F, then G, then H, then J. By the final versions, the Panzer IV weighed nearly twice what it did originally. It carried extra armor bolted to the sides, called Schürzen or skirts, to protect against Soviet anti-tank rifles. It never stopped being in frontline service until the last day of the war.
Over 8,500 Panzer IVs were built. It fought in Poland, France, North Africa, the Eastern Front, Normandy, the Ardennes, and Berlin. No other tank served in every major German theater of the entire war. It wasn't the best tank Germany had, but it may have been the most important.
4.
Comet tank, United Kingdom. Britain finally gets it right, 1 year too late. The British spent most of World War II building tanks that were too slow, too lightly gunned, too mechanically unreliable, or some combination of all three. The Comet arrived in 1944 and represented something genuinely rare in British armored development, a tank that actually worked. Fast enough, 32 miles per hour, well-armored enough, 102 millimeters on the turret front, and armed with a 77 millimeter HV gun, a shortened version of the 17-pounder that could penetrate a Panther's side armor at 1,000 yards without breaking a sweat.
British tankers who'd been fighting in Shermans and Cromwells, tanks they privately called Tommy Cookers and Ronsons because they caught fire so readily, described getting into a Comet for the first time with something close to religious relief. Here's the fresh perspective. The Comet arrived in December 1944. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. It saw 5 months of combat in a war where the real learning had taken 4 years. Every lesson about gun armor balance, every hard-won piece of tactical knowledge about how tanks actually need to function, the Comet embodied it all. It was the right tank at the right time. The time was just almost over. If Britain had produced this in 1943, the story of Allied armored warfare in Europe looks meaningfully different. Instead, it's one of history's great what-ifs, a machine that proved the British could do it, arriving precisely when it no longer mattered quite so much.
Tier 1. The war-winning workhorses. 2. T-34. Soviet Union.
If one machine changed the outcome of the Second World War, it was the T-34. When German tank crews first encountered it in July 1941, just weeks into Operation Barbarossa, they were shaken in a way that nothing had shaken them before. Their standard anti-tank guns bounced off its sloped armor. Their Panzer IIIs and IVs couldn't reliably penetrate it at combat range. German General Erich von Kleist called it the finest tank in the world when he encountered it. General von Rundstedt reported that the T-34 represented a complete surprise. What made it so revolutionary? 3 things: slope, gun, and simplicity. The T-34's 45mm hull armor was sloped at 60 degrees. Due to the physics of armor penetration, this made it functionally equivalent to nearly 90mm of vertical plate. The 76.2mm gun could handle any German tank of the period, and its construction, welded rather than bolted, designed for rapid mass production, meant that Soviet factories could churn them out faster than Germany could destroy them. Early T-34s had real weaknesses: poor visibility, a 2-man turret that forced the commander to also serve as killner, and radios that were initially rare. Soviet crews died in enormous numbers in 1941 and 1942, but the tank kept improving. The T-34-85, introduced in 1944, added a larger turret with an 85mm gun, a dedicated commander, and radios in every vehicle. By 1944, the Red Army was fielding them in corps of hundreds at a time. Germany had no answer. Over 84,000 T-34s were built in total. No other tank in history was produced in greater numbers. And in the vast, brutal, industrial killing ground of the Eastern Front, numbers were everything.
1. M4 Sherman, United States.
No tank in World War II generates more argument than the Sherman, and that argument is, at its core, a moral one. The M4 Sherman was America's primary tank, and it was produced in almost incomprehensible numbers, over 49,000 built between 1942 and 1945. It was reliable, it was easy to maintain, it could be loaded onto ships, transported across oceans, unloaded, fueled up, and driven into battle within hours. For a global war fought across 3 continents, that wasn't a feature, it was a strategic asset. But here's the brutal truth that every Sherman crew member knew. In a straight fight with a Tiger I or a Panther, the Sherman lost. Its 75mm gun in standard configuration couldn't reliably penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor at combat ranges, and the Sherman's own armor, 76mm maximum, could be penetrated by German 88mm guns from well over a kilometer. Early Shermans caught fire so readily from penetrating hits that German crews called them Tommy Cookers, and Allied soldiers called them Ronsons. Late-war Shermans with the high-velocity 76mm gun and wet stowage to prevent ammo fires were genuinely competitive machines, and in the hands of experienced crews with artillery and air support, Sherman battalions ground the Wehrmacht into dust. It wasn't the best tank, it was the right system.
If you liked this video, I'm sure you'll like this one too. Subscribe if you enjoyed this video.